It's day 2 of Men's Health Week 2022. My name's Emily Pearson, the founder and managing director at Our Minds Work, and I'm here with Jonny Ward, who is probably more better known as the Anxious Fireman on LinkedIn. And today we're here to talk about men's health from Jonny's perspective, from two sides really, working in a very male-dominated organisation, working in the fire service. I'd love to hear your thoughts on if you've seen a change in how the service is opening up and talking about mental health and well-being, but also more recently, you're now working in treatments and therapy. So again, a very female-dominated service that we know through research. Many men are not accessing treatments and therapies, especially around talking treatments and therapies. So I'd love to get your perspective on that today as well. So would you like to introduce yourself, Jonny, and tell us how you got here? You know, how are you here talking to me today?
Well, thank you very much, Emily. Hello, everyone listening to this. My name's Jonny Ward, and like you say, Emily, my kind of stage name, if you like, is the Anxious Fireman, which some people would recognise more than my actual name, I think, these days. How did I get here talking to you? Well, actually, if you remember, that's because we had an argument on LinkedIn, if I remember rightly.
That's not like me.
We kind of sort of pseudo fell out, didn't we? Not fall out. We had differing opinions on something, and then ended up actually doing something that I think was quite mature, which was to sort of actually sit down and chat a bit of it through. And for the record, I came around to your way of thinking. So I think that's the sort of short story and the short answer to that. But I suppose the long answer to your question is my background is I've been in the fire and rescue service for 15 years now. I joined at 23, and I'm still there, still absolutely love it. If I'd have taken myself back kind of maybe 12 years now, mental health was not particularly on my radar. It was something that I was sort of semi-interested in, but it was not particularly on my radar until I, very sort of cliche, we'll get into this with the therapy, kind of wounded healery, started struggling with my own sort of anxiety problems and panic attacks and very, very high levels of anxiety, mostly driven by kind of stuff from my upbringing, but also the environment that I was in, kind of not really allowing to process that anxiety, and that led me on bit of a journey. And again, I don't want to be too cliche, but a bit of a journey, bit of a grounding, bit of a sort of renewed sense of myself, really, that I had therapy myself. I took medication, and I became fascinated in the process of psychotherapy and the actual process of it, really. I just sort of fell in love with it by going through it. And on the backside of sort of feeling better and coming out of therapy, I no plan. I've never had a plan. The Anxious Fireman, for example, has never had a plan. Like, I don't have a business plan. I just kind of keep doing. I try and get better at it. I just started doing psychotherapy training, figured out how you actually became a psychotherapist, and that within itself is a minefield. And I just kept working my way through till eventually I left Salford University with my PG dip in psychotherapy, and now apparently I'm a BACP registered psychotherapist, and that led to the Anxious Fireman, where I started offering training and sort of awareness courses, and eventually into LinkedIn, and then eventually to your door. So yeah.
And can I just say for the record that not once did I pay you or bully you into turning to my way of thinking about what we argued about.
No, you intellectually persuaded me, and very fairly so.
Great, just in case, because a lot of people who know me probably think I was bullying you into that.
No, definitely.
That's a bit of an amazing journey, and I suppose from the male perspective, probably quite a unique way of solving the problems that you were experiencing. We've seen through a lot of the research that many men choose often not to talk about the problems and not to access treatments and therapies, and can internalize that a lot, which unfortunately leads to some of the problems that we're trying to solve when it comes to men's health. Is the 5th biggest killer of men is suicide, and especially in that male dominated industry as well. So I'm really interested to talk to you from the fire service perspective I myself was involved in building the Blue Light programme, which was commissioned by the government and designed by Mind. Gosh, 6 years ago now, you know, when mental health in the workplace really just became a thing. And what we saw when we went into these organizations was very male dominated. The masculinity norms were really, really entrenched in, you've got to be strong to do a job like this and to deal with the occupational hazards, you know, the psychological injuries that come along with working in those services, and almost the lack of support that would be provided. What we heard from a lot of personnel would be they didn't necessarily talk at work about the problems that they were facing because of this. Be strong, it's just part of the job. And a lot of the places where they would be presented to kind of deal with some of those problems, the gyms were all closed down, and the fire stations, you know, the social pub that was always attached to, you know, the prison service, and all of these social environments and ways to deal with that were really taken away. And a lot of personnel felt as if they couldn't go home and talk to the partners, because, you know, if you've just dealt with a road traffic accident at work, why would you want to go home and talk to your partner about that and, you know, share that kind of trauma on somebody else? So there was a lot of kind of stigma and that needed breaking down, and finding new ways to actually have conversations around mental health and well-being, so that it was around, you know, increasing help-seeking behaviour before it began to be a crisis. And the Mind research did show that, you know, 1 in 4 emergency service personnel had thoughts of taking their own lives. That is shocking, absolutely shocking statistic. So what have you seen from your perspective working in that industry? And have you seen a change towards being more open and honest around talking about mental health and well-being? And what do you think that's been triggered by?
Yes, without doubt. I've seen a change and a shift. And if I go back to when I joined sort of 15 years ago, I think I sort of landed on the kind of the back end of the old sort of traditional fire service. And I suppose before I move on any further, let me just clarify that I can only give you my perception and my experience. I can't speak for every firefighter out there, and I certainly am not speaking for my service, for example, but certainly from my perspective, there's a big change. I think when I joined 15 years ago, there was a lot of what we would call very senior firefighters. There was 30-year men generally, very, very few women. And you sort of joined as a young firefighter, surrounded by mostly much older men, very experienced in their job and very good at their job. I'm not ever taking that away from them, but still very entrenched in that kind of culture, where mental health, physical health was just kind of not on the lexicon, really. It wasn't even in the, you know, even in some people's vocabulary, let alone on the radar. You know, it wasn't even there. But there was this definite culture of, and where I think it really sits and where I think it really stemmed, it wasn't just even in health, it was in maybe the way we trained to put out incidents, you know, to deal with incidents, or the way we sort of did the work at the station. If it wasn't perfect, that was it. You were rubbish, you were belittled, you were insulted, especially as a new firefighter. And then that sort of culture continued. If you got something wrong on a training exercise, you were belittled. You know, you weren't supported, you were belittled. And that's the way in the past, in my experience, the culture is that anything wrong, you belittled. And that just extended out into you know, health and mental health as well. So it became, you know, like a very sort of trapping cage at times. I remember going into work a few times and being really afraid of just, I've got this drill that I've got to do today, and I've got this presentation that I've got to deliver, and you know, terrified of this sort of reaction. And even if I got it right, I knew this reaction would still be this kind of Mickey taking and all that sort of stuff. And that culture was heavily entrenched within the service, and it does what it always does, and what it, you know, and the reason that I think and those cultures have to change, we shouldn't change, we shouldn't want to change, they have to change, and they have, was that we had also a massively high rate of suicide, and there's, you know, we talk about proof in pudding, and there it is. So we have, you know, we have this sort of macho cliche culture with high levels of suicide, and if that isn't just a, you know, a kind of a conveyor belt of pain, then I don't know what is, you know, and suffering, then I don't know what is. So yeah, it changed a lot, and you know, unfortunately, some of the catalysts that I certainly saw within my service is we had a string of suicides within the service, two of which were quite close friends, a couple more of which I knew, but I didn't know them well. They were other parts of the service. And that sort of really focused people's mind onto, right, what are we getting wrong here? What are we getting wrong? And we then saw this sort of huge influx of human resources teams, people teams, leadership teams come into the service. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of sort of resistance to that straight away. A lot of new ways of thinking, you know, managers actually being trained to be managers rather than just getting promoted because they were good firefighters. Actual support mechanisms in place, you know, an improvement on things like employee assistance programs, but not just, you know, the actual program, but access to them and the way we did it. Eventually, we set up a health and wellbeing team as a service, and we employed a psychologist, and all these sorts of things started to slowly but surely change. It didn't go perfect, and it had a lot of resistance because you're fighting against an entrenched culture, but has it changed? Dramatically, yeah, dramatically, and so much for the better. And even things like the way we recruit now. So we recruit, you know, a lot more women join the service, a lot more people of BAME backgrounds, you know, different sexualities. So it's sort of breaking up that sort of old culture, which, you know, I kind of sometimes sort of, because I'm part of that, you know, I'm a straight white man, so I sometimes feel almost like why am I justified to talk about this? But I guess it's something that I've observed, and you know, it's sort of completely changed the feel of the place. So certainly the fire station, the feel is different. It doesn't feel as threatening. It doesn't feel as scary. It doesn't feel as sort of aggressive when you're on the station, you know, and so much for the better.
Do you think then that from your own experience of your lived experience of it, anxiety, panic attacks, have you seen that change help to improve your mental health and well-being as well? You know, tell us a little bit about how that impacted you personally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I won't bore you too much with the sort of background of it, but in essence, I started having sort of really high levels of anxiety 10 years ago, roughly. You know, I can't quite remember, but about 10 years ago. And these started coming out as like panic attacks. Now, if we talk about generic health here, when that first happened, like I imagine a lot of people, I thought there was something physically wrong with me, like something wrong with my heart, I'm having heart attacks, all these sort of things. Sort of went to A&E, God, 20 times. Kept getting told there's nothing wrong with me, and sort of kind of was convinced that something was, and you can call this health anxiety, whatever you want to call it. You know, if you want to label it or give it a name, but it's sort of health anxiety, this constant fear of what's going on in my body. But what was really confining to that was that because of the culture at the time, that sort of fear of judgment and vulnerability and sort of being open and honest about it. You know, I had a manager at the time who, you know, I tried to tell him that I was struggling with this stuff, and he basically, I mean, I won't repeat his exact words, but it was, "I'm not overly bothered," type of words in a much more crude way that I won't repeat now. But you know, I remember once coming in with like one of these little heart monitors on, and I basically got in belittled for it, even though I was trying to figure out what was going on with me and all this sort of stuff. So the sort of the environment and the culture was not one where you felt you could come in and go, you know what, I'm having a rough time. Can you look after me? Can you support me? Can you make me feel safe, I suppose? And that just wasn't a thing. And that for me was what was really keeping the anxiety locked in. I know, for example, you're a sort of big opponent of sort of culture of an organization, not just fixes at the end. Don't just fix broken people, create an environment where they're well. And I believe that myself now. And that was what was wrong. I was not in a culture or an environment where I felt safe to be vulnerable. And because of that, it was perpetuated. Because all anxiety is fear of the future, isn't it? And I was constantly fearing, will I be judged? Will I be, insulted? Will I be vulnerable? Will I be good enough to do my job? Will I, what if, which was driving the anxiety, making the panic attacks work. And it wasn't until I kind of eventually, I don't know, like came out as an anxious person, I suppose, if that's the right words for it, that things started to change. And I was fortunate that I'd moved to a different watch with a different manager, and actually they were absolutely brilliant. And it was almost like this weight off when I told the whole watch that I was struggling with these panic attacks, because one of them just went, okay, what do you need? And that's all I needed. I didn't need anything else. There was nothing practical. It's not like you need to make me a sandwich, like it was just literally, I just needed them to go, it's okay, mate. We've got you. Yeah. And that was what was so powerful to me. It just felt like I'd taken a massive rucksack of bricks up. I can feel myself like thinking about it, and I just needed to have that place, just people to go, all right, what do you need, Jonny?
Yeah.
And that was it.
Yeah.
That's all I needed.
And you say that's all I needed, but that is just so powerful, isn't it? That actually acceptance is what we need. And why is it so hard to give to people?
And for the record, that isn't all I needed. Like that's all I needed in that particular moment from my watch. I had therapy and medication and all sorts of things that I needed too. But at that moment, that was all I needed from them.
Absolutely. And I think this for many men is what we see through a lot of the research around, as we know, men will talk about their mental health and well-being. There needs to be an environment to allow that to happen. And been talking to Paul from Man Health, we talked to John Simons the other day around this same topic. Is it that men don't talk, or is it that we're just not listening and we're not actually creating the environments for it to be safe to do so?
I completely agree with that. And forgive me, I just I think it's a really, really important point. I see this all the time, and I don't blame anybody because they're doing what they think is right. And it might potentially, well, I'll ask you the question, is that a female perspective of it, where it's you just need to talk, you just need to open up? Whereas from a male perspective, I would argue that we need to go deeper and create an environment where it's okay to talk, then the talking will organically come. Men are not, we're not sort of born not wanting to talk about our mental health, our emotional health. We're created to do that. We're sort of socially driven to become like that. If you're going to change that, then it's not about just telling someone that's been sort of told not to talk about their mental health their whole life is not going to work. You need to rechange the environment so that they feel comfortable to, and that can be for women as well, or any gender. So sometimes just telling people to talk can actually be frustrating because it's not that easy.
Exactly. It's not the environment to do it, is it? And if we do open up and we're not met with acceptance and support, that can actually set people back in the recovery journey, can make their mental health and well-being worse. So that psychologically safe environment to do that is a really, really important part of that, absolutely. And just shows the powerful nature that it brings along with it. So then moving into the new perspective of now working in treatments and therapies, which is a very female-dominated field to work in. Not many guys working in that space at all. What has been your perspective from a man working in that industry as a male therapist, but also, your clients and the people who you work with, are the majority of them female? What are your experiences with this?
No, that's a really, really good question. And you're right. When I went to, for example, to Salford University to finish to do my sort of final level training, I think I was one of two men on a course of 100, rest of which were women. And I didn't, maybe naively, I didn't even realize that would be the case until I got there. And then as soon as I walked through the door, I thought, this is, I didn't even think of that, but it's so true. And that's been the case ever since. If you look around for therapists, men are there, but we're certainly in the minority. I think what I've certainly noticed is I have clients from both, from men and women and all sorts of backgrounds, but I do think being a male therapist has sort of allowed, is that the right word? I get quite a lot of inquiries from them. I get one thing I've definitely noticed is I get lots of inquiries from them. So I get people message me saying, "Hi Johnny, seen your profile, seen you advertise, someone's recommended you, whatever it might be. I'm really interested in therapy." And I'll send something back, and it'll be a case of, okay, well, that's great. Should we have a meeting and we can have a quick half an hour chat about what that might be? And I sometimes get that half an hour chat, and then after that, I would say 50-60% of the men who initially inquire maybe don't come back for therapy. Now, that either means I'm not doing a good job, but I hope that's not the case. But I think there's something more about this sort of reticence and this sort of fear to access, and I certainly pick that up with clients when I first start working with them. This sort of almost like they're dipping their toe into the water. They're sort of cautiously trying it out, and then it becomes too difficult or too sort of challenging or too painful or whatever it might be. And sometimes you go back to old habits, and the male habit is to sort of suppress what's going on for them. And I always say that you suppress your emotions, they end up depressed, and depression, depressing your emotions is not healthy, and expression is the opposite of depression. It becomes easier to depress them, so and it becomes a habit for them, I think. So they almost feel, well, you know what, this has worked so far, so keep doing it.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And I think I always go back to, how do we engage men? How do we do this? And I always think about, the men in my life who are very, very important to me. And when we see that because of some of these problems that we're talking about, that men unfortunately die a lot earlier than women do, because they go unvoiced, they're not accessing the treatment and support that they want because of a lot of this kind of stigma, and we can't talk about it, and this weakness is, how do we really engage men and help to increase that, to improve men's mental health and well-being? And I always think back to, I'm really quite interested in evolutionary psychology and biology, and I always think back to, a millennia ago, where the women in the tribe, well, actually, that's still a reality in some tribes in Africa and, these untouched places. You have the women who were sat round in the communities, looking after the children, doing the cleaning and the cooking, and the men are out there for days, hunting for food, being very, very practical, and the women are sat there talking about the problems. So this is like really hardwired stuff, isn't it? This is down to our genes and our biology sometimes. Like, how do we really engage men? And I suppose the more I talk about it with guys who are in similar situations to you, is we know that men are open to talking about. We've got to create an environment, reach out to guys instead of waiting for them to reach out for support once it's a crisis. And I'm also thinking about one of the things that you just said there around men are, in your perspective, you found that you've seen a lot of men kind of reach out to you because you're a male working in that treatment, in those styles of treatments and therapies. Do you think that men, when they're asked to talk to women or think that they have to talk to women about their problems, that it is a positive thing? Or do you think that many men will feel kind of emasculated opening up to women because they have to show vulnerability to the opposite sex, that they're built in to actually show the strength and their masculine side? Is it as complex as that? And is it easier for men to talk about the problems to men, to their male peers, in that environment? I suppose it's a bit like me thinking about, as a woman, would I feel more comfortable talking about my periods and menopause to a woman than I would to a man? What do you see?
So I think, let me sort of try and break down my thoughts on this as the best I can, because that's a huge topic, isn't it? And I think there's definitely something around, I suppose, one thing that if I just start, let me start from the beginning. So you talked about tribes and all that sort of stuff, and obviously I'm not as maybe as versed as you are, but something that I do something called existential therapy, and that kind of therapy sort of looks at sort of big picture stuff and you know, goals and purposes and all that sort of stuff. And I think, without trying to get too philosophical here, capitalism is not good for mental health. Period. It's just not. It's not designed to be. I'm not sort of trying to change that right here, right now. I'm not sort of trying to, you know, throw the whole like sort of system up in the air. But the point is that capitalism sort of breeds individualism, and it breeds people that feel like they have to look after themselves. It sort of breaks up tribes. It means that, you know, I mean, if I look, I'm sat in my house, you know, I don't live with my parents. I don't live with anyone else. If I'm struggling, I won't ask my neighbors, you know, whereas in the past that might have happened. So it sort of individualizes people, especially men. Who come from that background of, you said, you know, they'll go out, they'll hunt, they'll be out for days, they'll provide, if you like. Now, I think that within itself is changing, and I think that's a positive thing. I think it's sort of rebalancing the kind of the loads, if you like. You know, for example, I do a lot of my childcare. I'll do a lot of, you know, I'll take days off and take my little girl out and things like that. So that's probably different than it was many years ago. So I think that's definitely changing, but I think there's still this sort of remnants of, you know, men, you are responsible for your family, and you cannot ask for support because we've individualized people within our kind of systems. And I think that sort of caught men off guard in a way. But that's sort of the macro level. That's the kind of the big level, isn't it? An overall sort of strategy. When it comes to sort of individuals, I think it will very much depend on individuals' sort of upbringing. You know, I'm a proponent of things like attachment theory, if you probably know what that is. And, the way people have sort of been raised when they were growing up. And I think for some men, if they had a supportive father, if they had, you know, an open and honest sort of father, or they're really supported by their mother, it can be different. So if you had a, say, non-supportive father, then they might find talking to men more difficult. If they have come from an environment where men aren't accessible for kind of emotional things, then they'll continue that kind of narrative. So I think on a sort of micro and individual level, it very much depend on people's upbringings and where they've come from, about whether they're more comfortable talking to men or women. With therapists, for example, I found more comfortable talking to women. I'm literally just thinking about this on the fly, and I didn't realize it, but I was much more comfortable in talking to women, and that's because I felt safer. But I think that's very much come from my parenting. My dad's not a bad guy, but he was quite tough. He was quite emotionally unavailable. Then I went to an all boys school, for example, where it was very much kind of, you know, dog eat dog. And then I was on the rugby team, which is, as you can imagine, that kind of culture. Then I was in the Territorial Army, so then you can imagine that kind of culture. Then I was in fire service. So, you know, I mean, I've come from an environment where that, you know, that isn't, you know, male sort of thing, isn't a thing. And I think, but I had a very sort of emotionally accessible mother, so I think that would suggest, you know, not trying to get too Freudian on you, being able to, you know, speak to a female therapist. So I think it depends on the individuals, you know, it's how that kind of works out. But on a larger scale, yeah, I think there's kind of two things for me, and that's that men need to take some responsibility of allowing environments for other men to show vulnerability. And if we can all do that and kind of soften the blow in a way, that's a big thing. But let me ask you, if men feel they need to be strong and be sort of providers for women, where do women play a role in allowing men to be vulnerable as well? Because if part of it is that we put it in a really crude term, trying to impress women, trying to be the masculine man who can, you know, protect women and sort of attract a mate, if we're really going to get down into the biology of it, where's the women's role in kind of allowing men to be vulnerable too? How do you see that work?
Yeah, do you know what? I don't have an answer for that at all. I don't have an answer, and I think this is why this topic is just so interesting to me, because I look at it from my own perspective as well. And quite similar to you. I actually find it easier to talk to guys, and that's because I had a much more prominent father figure in my life than I haven't spoke to my mum for probably about 5 or 6 years now. And that has been since I left home at the age of 16. So I've had a long period of not having positive female role models in my life. So I totally get that. So I always had a very strong father figure who taught me a lot, great relationship, able to talk to him. And I think from that, I really kind of learned to understand him and filter that into my male relationships. I have a lot more male friends than I do female friends. And my husband, very macho, ex-military, comes from Zimbabwe, so their cultural norms of masculinity and femininity are very, very different from the UK here as well. So, and I think we have to understand each other a bit more and tolerate each other a little bit more when it comes to our differences. And allow those things to happen. And there's been some really prominent moments that have really helped me to understand that. And I'll mention it here, is two that stick out from my mind. One of them was when my elderly cat died. I took the cat home. I wanted to bury him in the garden, and I'm just sobbing my heart out, cuddling this dead cat, really, really distraught. And my husband was outside with a shovel digging a hole in the garden, like totally practical, wasn't visibly upset about it. And he was just doing what he had to do to help me get through this moment. And he did what he could do, which was take a shovel and dig a big hole in the garden. And then another situation was, we were watching something really, really upsetting, and I've never seen my husband cry. And I said, I'm sat there blaring my eyes out, and I was like, why are you not upset by that? How come you're not crying? This, it was really, really upsetting. And he said, Emily, just because I'm not showing it doesn't mean I'm not feeling it inside. And these have been really profound moments that we can sometimes, because we don't see things, or because things are not the same as the way that we would respond to it, we think that they're abnormal. And actually that's very normal. It's a very normal response for many men to not show outwardly their emotions, but are internalizing them and really, really feeling them. But because we don't see them, we're like, well, you need to cry, men, you just need to cry more, men, you just need to talk more. And it's just not as simple as that. So I know I don't have the answers to that problem at all. And
I'm not sure I do. And if I could come back a little bit about what the way maybe emotions are shown, I agree. It might not be. It might be in a more sort of acceptable way. So it might be through anger. It might be through drinking. It might be through fighting. It might be through, some form of addiction. It might, or sport or something where, the emotion is shown or the emotion is released, but in a way that is, we could call it unhealthy, but kind of is maybe more socially acceptable. How many men do we see in a pub every Friday night drinking by themselves, or how many men are fighting out in, I live in Manchester, so, out in the streets. And I'm not saying it's right, I'm not justifying it, but what I'm saying is what's going on there, what's feeding that. And, it can be, even if we, these sort of emotional addictions in a way of how men release them. And sometimes addictions can make our heroes, can't they? Sports stars become addicted to something, and actually they're just addicted to maybe ignoring something else that's going on with them. I don't know, I'm massively sort of wandering off in my own head here, but I suppose that maybe men do sometimes show their emotions not in the healthiest way, because the healthy ways are, almost like a road closed sign on certainly a one-way street.
Absolutely. So my final question before we end our little chat. We know we're not doing enough to improve men's health and well-being. We know that. What do you think we could do more? If there's just one more thing that we could do to help to improve men's health and well-being, what do you think it could be?
Can I go with 2?
Okay,
All right.
I'll let you have 2.
From a generic level, from a general level around the world, like just generically for human beings, learn to listen rather than telling people to talk. I think that's much more valuable. And look, ultimately, we're here on a sort of it's called a LinkedIn platform, which is work based. Look for the right people to promote within organizations that will create an environment and a culture that is safe to be vulnerable, to express it, to make mistakes. It doesn't always have to be emotions. It could be just trying something and making a mistake and that being okay. So if you, instead of sort of always assuming that, I know a lot of organizations don't do this anymore, but instead of, stereotypically assuming that, I don't know, the strong man's the best leader, look at it like, well, who is going to create an environment where people feel psychologically safe? They're your leaders. They're the people that can actually make a difference. So I would say those 2 things. 1, learn to listen. In a business organization, promote people that can empathize and care.
Positive role model, isn't it? I think that's exactly what it is. So absolutely, this is definitely one of the things that we're looking to help organizations to do, to really embed positive male role models in the workplace, to help to listen more, increase help-seeking behavior much earlier, and provide information and to people so that they're able to access their own help when they need it as well. Because I think many people just in general would prefer to be able to access information themselves without having to speak to a third party to then get at, why should I need to speak to a mental health first aider to be told about information that I need to know? It should be freely accessible to us, So I think that positive role model and listening is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. Men don't want to be poorly. Like that's not, I just want to, for any women out there, that's not like a thing that we do to sort of, because we get out of it. Like, men don't take their lives because it's sort of like some sort of male cool thing. It's really horrible. It's horrible, horrible pain. So we're not doing that to be funny.
Absolutely.
Like that isn't something that men want.
Exactly. And I think our conversation today just shows the complexities of the topic that we're trying to cover here, and the magnitude of the problem of how do we improve men's health and well-being. But thank you. Definitely. Thanks so much for chatting to us today, Jonny. This will be put out at some point this week for Men's Health Week. Thanks for being a positive male role model and an ambassador for men's health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you so much.